I'm hoping this is on. If it isn't, just close your eyes, and when I'm finished, we'll sing or something and wake you up. In case you didn't catch it, I'm David Maybury, rather than Catherine, who's here in the front row, and we're the Ontario coordinators for the Canadian Food Grains Bank. And so one of the great joys that we have is that almost every Sunday we get to go to a different church across the province and to a variety of denominations and share a little good news of the work that you're doing around the world through your contributions to the Food Grains Bank. And it's that transparent reporting back to congregations of their work that I think is one of the great joys that Catherine and I find at the Food Grains Bank. Now, Sherry said that she'll advance the slides. All I have to do is tell her when. So, oh, she's waving at me. She's ready to go. So let's begin with a word of prayer. God of infinite wisdom and understanding, cause your Spirit to descend upon us, to surround each one of us, to invade our very thoughts, that which is spoken and that which is heard might be acceptable this day and always. Amen. Next slide, please, Sherry. Psalm 65 is an interesting passage, and I have to wonder as I read it, what had happened that David, as he's collecting his thoughts, what is he really reflecting on? Psalm 65 is really the beginning of a mini-series of 4 psalms, with the following 3 building upon or reinforcing Psalm 65. And if you have a few minutes, it's actually worth reading them all together and seeing the connection. But it strikes me that some great blessing has come to the people. And David wants to, in fact, needs to talk about it, to sing for sheer joy, to express his greatest appreciation and thanksgiving. We all know that feeling, because we've all experienced it. And we've seen it in others as well. When we're overcome by emotions of the moment, that we're so filled with joy and thankfulness that we can't really express it, that we can barely get the words out. As we read Psalm 65, I sense that that's how the psalmist is feeling at that moment. As you read through the passage, you begin to wonder, what is he thankful for? What is he all fired up about? It isn't until we get to the 9th verse that David, so filled with thanksgiving and praise, finally gives us a clue as to what he's thinking about. He starts talking about the abundance harvest. And then finally in verse 11, in the King James Version, he declares, "You crowneth your year with goodness, and thy paths drop fatness." This has not just been a good year, folks. According to the psalmist, God has gone well beyond just giving an abundant harvest. He's crowned it even with his richness. David calls it fatness. And it was evident wherever God had been. That fatness, this rich blessing falls on the pastures and on the hillsides. And one realizes that wherever David looks, he's overwhelmed by the blessing he sees. Next slide. Finally, in verse 13, David says, "The pastures are clothed in your flocks, the valleys covered with your corn." Now, for a farmer like me, this makes sense, because grain crops were always grown in the valleys where there was more moisture, and the small wandering flocks would usually eke out their existence on the sparse or barren hillsides. But in the year that David's talking about, things are different. The valleys are filled with an abundant crop, far more than enough. And the hills, one translation says, were white with flocks. Unlike today, the people of David's time knew the direct connection between the success of the harvest and their ability to thrive and survive. The people were deeply rooted in the land. They knew their very existence depended on the weather, something they couldn't control. They had experienced both the good times and times of drought and want, times of resulting hunger and despair. It's no wonder then that as they experienced this amazing harvest, probably the best they've ever seen, that they would, as the psalm says, shout for joy and also sing. Next slide. Today, as Christians and as a faith community, we understand Jesus is called to be the hands and feet of God, that we are blessed to be a blessing, that we are to reach out in love to those in need, to feed the hungry and give drink to the thirsty. We know that we are to be a blessing not just in this church and community, but to the whole world. And you do that both as a church and as a denomination through a number of organizations, one being Presbyterian World Service and Development. This morning I want to report on just one of the ways that the Presbyterian Church in Canada and the Presbyterian World Service and Development, working in cooperation with other Canadian Christian denominations, extends the table of hospitality and sharing. Next slide. The idea of the Food Grains Bank actually had its conception in the early 1970s in Bangladesh. A group of Mennonite volunteers who had been helping clean up and rebuilding after a devastating super cyclone had gathered one evening for a time of fellowship. Someone brought out a farm newspaper from Western Canada, and on the cover there was a picture and a story of grain being piled in the fields because of a lack of storage in markets. Someone made the simple comment that there had to be a way of connecting the abundance of a Canadian harvest to the desperate situation they saw every day. The Food Grains Bank was born. One of the Mennonite volunteers would return to Winnipeg and convince the Mennonite Central Committee to develop such a mechanism. This idea of collecting and shipping grain was not really new to the Mennonites, because they had started doing it way back in 1920. But this concept was going to be slightly different. Next slide. It would be based loosely on the Joseph principle of banking grain in times or areas of surplus, and then using them in times and areas of need. The Mennonites established their grain bank using commercial facilities in 1976. And in 1983, they invited all other denominations to join them in creating a national and ecumenical Canadian Food Grains Bank. Presbyterian World Service and Developed joined the Food Grains Bank family in 1992. And today, the Food Grains Bank has 15 national members or churches and their outreach agencies representing some 30 denominations and 17,000 congregations and parishes across Canada. From the very beginning, the Food Grains Bank was to be a servant to the national churches by developing excellence in responding to global hunger as a Christian response to hunger. Next slide, Chair. Today, Food Grains Bank works in three very distinct but related areas of hunger: food assistance, food security, and food justice. If you think of the adage, give a person a fish and they will eat for today, that's food assistance. Teach a person to fish and they can eat for a lifetime, that's food security. But asking the question, why are people hungry? Do they have access to the pond? Is food justice. Next slide. The original concept for the Food Grains Bank was that farmers would be asked to donate from their harvests at their local elevators, and that the Food Grains Bank would receive and bank these donations to be programmed as necessary. Each member of the Food Grains Bank would have their own account, into which donations of grains and cash would be deposited. And while the Food Grains Bank started out as a grain bank, the image of farmers sharing their harvest, their first fruits, has so inspired others that almost every year cash donations have exceeded grain donations. Today, about 60% of the donations come as cash and 40% as grain. Grain is donated by individual farmers or from community growing projects, where usually faith communities grow a specific field or fields of grain for the Food Grains Bank. Currently in Ontario, there's 115 of these community projects, ranging in size from 1 acre to 300 acres. Presbyterians are involved in 23 of the 115. In total, the Presbyterian account last year received about $280,000 in donations. The Food Grains Bank also receives a grant for food assistance from our federal government through the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development for $25 million each year, which can be used on a 4-to-1 matching basis. Next slide, please, Sherry. In the past year, Presbyterian World Service and Development have used their account to respond to 9 projects in 7 countries. There's a great deal of sharing between the Food Grains Bank members, and Presbyterian World Service and Development has both given support to others, but also received support from other denominations. Next slide, Chair. In South Sudan, PWS&D and the United Church have supported an Adventist project that provided more than 600 tons of food to internally displaced people fleeing the civil conflict there. The situation to me seems so tragic because of the hope the country had just 4 years ago when it became independent. Unfortunately, just over a year ago, the President and Vice President decided they didn't like each other very much. And so they gathered their respective tribes, the Nuers and the Dinkas, and they started a civil uprising. Unfortunately, they both occupy an area that is mostly the agricultural productive area in eastern South Sudan. Almost one-third today, almost one-third of the population are affected now, with several million people having left their homes. This spring, many crops weren't planted because of the conflict. And so despite this being one of the best growing years in decades, in fact, it was the kind of year that David was talking about in Psalm 65, there are few crops to be harvested. Next slide. In Pakistan, the United Church was a funder of a Presbyterian project through the Presbyterian partner Church World Service. This project, at almost $1.2 million, provided more than 1,800 families with 1,200 tons of food assistance, mostly wheat and legumes. In this very drought-prone area of the Sindh province, close to the Thar Desert, poverty levels are very high. And so for the first time that I can remember in the last 17 years that Catherine and I have been coordinators, not only did they provide food, but they provided boxes of matches so that people could light the fires to cook the food. How poor are you when you can't afford matches? Next slide. In Lebanon, the Presbyterian Church joined with the United Church in supporting another $1.6 million Mennonite project that has been experimenting with the provision of food vouchers. As you probably know, because of the ongoing crisis in Syria, Lebanon, which is a country of just over 4 million people, is now hosting about 1.3 million refugees. Many of these refugees came with little or nothing, seeking any kind of work or assistance they can find. Lebanon's ability to provide for these guests has become overwhelmed. In a program from the Food Grains Bank, rather than supplying food directly, the Food Grains Bank members are using the existing market infrastructure by providing food vouchers for refugees to exchange for certain commodities at agreed upon prices. The grocery store is reimbursed when they provide the vouchers and the accompanying cash register tapes. The Food Grains Bank was concerned about this project since this is one of the few times we've done it. And so the Mennonite Central Committee gathered all of the information to see how effective it was. And they were surprised because it was even more effective than they had actually anticipated it would be. This program supports local communities provides the beneficiaries with choices at the grocery store, and is very cost-effective to administer. It is expected that where conditions are right, as if conditions could be right, this model of food assistance will be used again in other crises. I realized that when I was writing this, that there's no way I could talk about all of the projects that Presbyterian World Service and Development had done through the Food Grains Bank last year. And I wanted to talk about projects that I just talked about because they might not be as familiar. You might not know as much about them. And I also knew that there would be two projects that probably everybody in this congregation would know about. And I was trying to decide which one would I bring you an update. Should I talk about Malawi because of the floods that are going on and because of the tremendous success you've had through the Conservation Agriculture Program? Or should I talk about Nicaragua? And I finally ended up deciding that I would talk about Nicaragua only because in the next month or two, we're expecting some guests from Malawi, Presbyterian World Service and Development is, and they're hoping to get them out to congregations, so you may have a chance to hear from them there. And because I realized that you all want to get home to Super Bowl or a bowl of soup downstairs, one or the other, so I thought I'd better cut this a little short. Next slide, please. In Nicaragua, Presbyterian World Service and Development supports two partners, one being CPAD in the central part of the country, and the other is Soyanica in the northern part, close to the Honduras border. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, just behind Haiti. 43% of the population live below the poverty line. In one area of Nicaragua, Presbyterian World Service and Development did a survey and found that 48% of children under the age of 5 are suffering from malnutrition. Both of the Presbyterian partners are working on holistic support for communities through a number of programs. There's a number of challenges in this area: depleted soils, soil erosion, monocropping, crop storage and utilization, changing weather patterns, lack of access to seeds, funds, materials, and even information. Both of your partners are adopting and adapting the successful conservation agricultural program that PWS&D has been using in Malawi. Conservation agriculture is a program of what we would call zero tillage that promotes soil and moisture conservation and the use of local seeds and crop nutrients. Next slide, please. But holistic community development requires more than increasing yields. It must address the community nutrition problems by encouraging the growing a wider variety of crops. In fact, that's where Soyanica started from. It introduced soybeans as a protein source to balance the heavy starch diet of a maize-eating country. Through the Conservation Agricultural Program, yields have increased. Farmers have some land that they can devote to other crops, such as fruits and vegetables. Part of the program you're funding through PWS&D account at the Food Grains Bank is the development of completely integrated fields and gardens, where both crop rotation and symbiotic crop relationships are employed. Not only does the local nutritional health improve, but as they increase crop yields, they end up having small surpluses that they can sell in the market. As they become more self-sufficient, the need for parents to leave the community to find work and for children to leave school is greatly reduced. Family units become more secure, relationally, nutritionally, and financially. Next slide. I want to finish with just one story, and this is Francisca's story. Francisca and her husband have 3 children, and they were working upon a very vulnerable hillside property in central Nicaragua. On their small plot, they couldn't grow enough food because of the dryness of the soil and because of the depletion of the soil. Soil organic matter and nutrients were depleted because of the continuous maize cropping, erosion, and the practice of burning off the crop residue to make the land easier to work. So Francisca's husband worked off the farm much of the year, to supplement their income to buy enough food for their 3 children. Despite the fact that their land was hilly and dry and that they had crop failures or barely enough food every year, Francisca was willing to take a chance. And so she joined the CPAD project and developed her own integrated farm plan. She followed the conservation agriculture program to zero till and planted a number of fruit trees supplied through your generosity. The results, and this was 2 years ago, the results have been simply amazing. In just 2 years, the fruit trees have started to yield, providing lemons, bananas, oranges, mangoes, and passion fruit. As the crops grow, not only do they shade the land, reducing evaporation, but the roots help hold the soil, preventing erosion. And the leaves, when they fall, provided much needed organic matter. In addition, the introduction of improved open pollinated seeds and composted manure and crop residues have increased Francisca's yields of maize. In fact, her production has more than doubled. Now she believes that with the total amount of land she has, if she converts it to conservation agriculture, she could actually get away with farming about 1/4 of the land that she used to work. This 3-year project wrapped up last year, and Francisca says she feels satisfied. She has learned enough. She is confident that she and the 250 other families in her community can take it from here. Francisca asked the group of Canadians that were visiting her project last year to thank you, to thank her brothers and sisters in Canada who helped make this happen. Her life has changed. Her life has been transformed. Her family is now food secure. She now sees, as she looks at her fields, bounty and hope instead of barren despair. Next slide. I believe more than anyone in this room, Francisca understands Psalm 65. For her heart is filled with thanksgiving for your help. And as the psalmist says, and if you've ever been to a church in Nicaragua, you'll know that they shout for joy, and they also sing. For your blessing